The Enemy Below was not just Dick Powell's most improbable directorial achievement. It was a Cold War moral argument dressed in the uniform of a World War II thriller, and it was nearly capsized by a director who had spent 20 years singing love songs for Busby Berkeley, a star who was already fighting a private war nobody on set knew about, and a studio so uncertain of the film's ending that it shot two completely different conclusions and let preview audiences vote on which men deserve to live. We are digging into the wreckage of The Enemy Below with 15 secrets Fox tried to bury, secrets locked inside production files at the Academy Library, military cooperation records, and the kind of out-of-print memoirs that only surface when you know which shelves to search. What the production's internal development correspondence makes visible is that the title, The Enemy Below, was always functioning on two registers simultaneously, and only one of them had anything to do with a submarine. The novel's title, which Wendell Mays carried intact into the screenplay, gestures toward a vertical geography of war, the destroyer above, the submarine beneath, hunter and hunted occupying separate physical planes. But the film's dialogue, in a line that Mays added to the source material, and that represents his most significant original contribution to the script, makes the second register explicit. When Murrell's ship's doctor delivers his summation of the duel, he describes both men as fighting not each other, but the force within humanity itself, the devil below the surface of civilized behavior, concluding that the real enemy is not German and not American. The title the studio's marketing division received was, in that reading, a philosophical statement about human nature dressed up as a nautical location. Nobody in the marketing division appears to have noticed. They sold it as a submarine picture. It was never quite that at all. By any conventional logic of 1956 Hollywood, Dick Powell had no standing to direct a war film of this ambition. His career trajectory was the most improbable in the business. A tenor crooner from Arkansas who had spent the 1930s smiling through Busby Berkeley production numbers, who had remade himself in 1944 as a hard-boiled private eye playing Philip Marlowe, and who had subsequently moved into production and television. He had directed exactly 4 films before The Enemy Below, none of them distinguished. His most recent directorial credit was The Conqueror in 1956, the John Wayne Genghis Khan film that would become one of the most catastrophically misjudged productions in Hollywood history, and whose legacy, as we shall see, would pursue Powell to his grave. The fact that 20th Century Fox handed him The Enemy Below, with its real naval hardware, its political sensitivity, and its requirement for precisely calibrated performances from two of the most formidably independent actors in the business, represents either an institutional act of faith or an institutional act of negligence. What Powell delivered proved it was faith. But the real problem was what The Conqueror had already done to him, and what nobody on The Enemy Below set understood yet. The Conqueror was filmed in 1954 in St. George, Utah, 90 miles downwind from the Nevada test site, where the United States military had conducted 11 above-ground nuclear detonations in the preceding 2 years. The cast and crew of 220 people spent 3 months in that desert. By 1981, 91 of those 220 had developed some form of cancer. 46 had died of it. John Wayne, Susan Hayward, Agnes Moorehead, and Pedro Armendariz were among them. Dick Powell, who had directed the film, who had spent the most concentrated time on location, was diagnosed with lymphoma in 1962 and died on January 2, 1963, at 58 years old. He died 6 years after completing The Enemy Below, the best film of his directing career, without ever knowing what had been seeded in his body in that Utah desert. When Powell stood on the deck of the USS Whitehurst off the coast of Hawaii in 1956, watching Mitchum and Jurgens perform the duel he had constructed, he was a dying man who did not know he was dying. The authority and precision of his direction reads differently once you know that. Wendell Mays received a screenplay credit for The Enemy Below, and the changes he made to Denys Rayner's 1956 novel represent a set of decisions whose political implications 20th Century Fox never publicly acknowledged. Rayner's novel featured a British destroyer, HMS Hecate. Its captain was British. Its moral universe was British, shaped by the specific experience of the Royal Navy's long, grinding, catastrophically costly anti-submarine campaign in the North Atlantic, a campaign in which Britain had borne the primary burden for 2 years before America entered the war. Mays and Fox Americanized the ship, the captain, and the institutional context entirely, transforming HMS Hecate into the fictional USS Haynes, and rebuilding the film's moral architecture around American naval identity. Rayner was alive and professionally active during the entire production. Whether he expressed formal objection to the national transplant, and what compensation, if any, he received beyond his adaptation fee, is not recorded in any publicly available correspondence. The silence is complete. What it produced was a film that owed its entire dramatic situation to a British officer's personal wartime experience, credited that experience accurately at the source level, and then systematically erased its Britishness in every frame. The existential pressure Powell brought to the enemy below was specific and undiscussed. His television company, Four Star Productions, co-founded with David Niven, Charles Boyer, and Ida Lupino, was by 1956 consuming the majority of his professional energy and capital. His film directing career had produced nothing that justified serious critical attention. The Enemy Below was, in a very practical sense, his last serious bid to establish himself as a film director of consequence before television absorbed him entirely. If the film failed or merely performed adequately without distinction, the narrative of Powell's career would close on the Busby Berkeley chapter and reopen in the television chapter, with nothing of lasting value between them. What he needed from The Enemy Below was not commercial success. The film's modest budget and Fox's distribution muscle would provide that regardless, but critical legitimacy. That is exactly what the film delivered. And then Powell died 6 years later, before the legitimacy he had earned could compound into anything further. The timing is one of the crueler ironies in post-war Hollywood biography. Before Robert Mitchum was attached to The Enemy Below, the role of Captain Morrell had been considered for actors whose screen personae would have produced an entirely different moral argument. The studio's early casting conversations circled around figures whose natural registers were more explicitly heroic, men whose presence would have framed Morrell's command authority as something the audience was expected to admire without ambivalence. What Mitchum brought instead was the quality his entire career had been defined by, and that critical fashion had persistently misread as laziness, an absolute refusal of performance. Mitchum did not act commands. He issued them, he did not demonstrate authority. He possessed it, in the particular unstated way of a man who has nothing left to prove to anyone. His morale is so devoid of display that the performance was, and remains, invisible to audiences trained to equate acting with visible effort. The Ogunquit Performing Arts Assessment stated it with precision. Mitchum was, only in retrospect, recognized as a master of the cinematic art of stillness. What looked effortless cost more than the visible kind. But the real problem was that the performance Mitchum was giving on the surface of the water was being matched below it by someone whose right to play that role carried a weight no casting director could have engineered. Curd Jurgens, Americanized in the film's credits to Curd Jurgens for audiences who might balk at the correct spelling, arrived on the set of The Enemy Below as the first German officer in a Hollywood war film who was not required to be a monster. This was his stated assessment, delivered in a 1977 New York Times interview. The picture was important to him, he said, because it was the first post-war American film in which a German officer was not interpreted as a freak. What the studio's publicity materials did not advertise was the specific biographical authority behind that statement. In 1944, Jurgens had gotten into an argument in a Viennese bar with a group of men he did not recognize, who turned out to include the brother of Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the head of the Reich Main Security Office, one of the most powerful men in the Nazi apparatus. The argument cost Jurgens his freedom. He was classified as a political unreliable and sent to a labor camp in Hungary. He escaped after several weeks, went into hiding, and emerged in 1945 to become an Austrian citizen, having renounced Germany permanently. The man playing the war-weary German officer who has no love for the New Germany was a man who had been imprisoned by the New Germany for saying exactly that, out loud, to the wrong people, in a bar in 1944. The performance required nothing from him that his life had not already rehearsed. The USS Whitehurst, DE 634, was a Buckley-class destroyer escort that had served in the Pacific throughout World War II, stationed at Pearl Harbor through the war's end. When 20th Century Fox requested naval cooperation for The Enemy Below, the Navy provided the Whitehurst directly, a real combat veteran, not a purpose-built studio replica. The production company then repainted the ship's hull number, changing the 634 to 181 to match the fictional USS Haynes. The cast spent a month aboard the Whitehurst in Hawaiian waters, and the men operating the phones, manning the guns, and crewing the depth charge stations in the film are the Whitehurst's actual sailors. The ship's commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Walter Smith, served as technical advisor and appears in the film itself. He is the man-o-tishan reading Little Orphan Annie comics during the lull before battle, piece of characterization so precisely observed that it could only have come from someone who knew exactly what sailors actually do during the hours between action. The Whitehurst was sunk as a torpedo target in 1971. The film is its most complete surviving record. What production records held in the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences Library confirm, and what the film's release history concealed entirely from the public, is that The Enemy Below had two fully completed, dramatically distinct endings. The original ending, faithfully reported in a July 1957 issue of The Hollywood Reporter, had both Morell and von Stolberg drown. Morell dives into the burning water to rescue von Stolberg, and neither man survives. Screenwriter Wendell Mayes later expressed his preference for this conclusion explicitly. The point, he said, was that both characters were men who had no remaining reason to live, and that the most honest statement the film could make was to let them die, one finally trying to help the other after having spent the entire film trying to kill him. Powell filmed this ending first, and then, unable to resolve his own objection that it was too bleak, filmed the survival ending as an alternative. Preview audiences, presented with both, chose survival. The ending in the released film is therefore not a creative decision. It is a market research outcome. The moral argument Mayes had written, that the duel consumed both men even as it produced mutual respect, was overruled by an audience that liked these characters too much to watch them drown. The film that exists is the film audiences voted for. The film Mayes intended is buried in the archive. Albert Beck, a former German submarine sailor who had served in the U-boat fleet during the war, was hired as the technical advisor for the film's U-boat sequences. His contribution was systematic and detailed. The handling of equipment, the spatial conventions of submarine operations, the precise behaviors of men who had spent months inside pressurized steel cylinders. Beck is uncredited in the finished film. His name appears in no publicity materials. The sequences he made possible, the conning tower procedures, the diving protocols, the way the crew moves and orients itself within the confined spaces of the boat, constitute the most technically authentic U-boat material in any American film up to that point. They were produced by a man who had been the actual enemy, advising a film that argued the actual enemy was worth understanding as a human being. The irony is not incidental. It is the film's thesis, demonstrated in its production methodology before a single frame was developed. Denys Rayner was a Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve officer who spent the entirety of the Battle of the Atlantic on convoy escort duty, first aboard the corvette HMS Verbena, later commanding destroyer groups in the North Atlantic. His 1956 novel, which he insisted was entirely fictional, nevertheless drew so directly from his accumulated experiential knowledge of anti-submarine warfare that the line between fiction and memoir was, in several respects, a matter of character names rather than substance. The novel's formal structure, 5 sections titled Radar Sparring, Azdic Duel, Gun Battle, Cold Steel, Fisticuffs, reads as the precise taxonomy of a man who had cataloged real tactical situations as lived experience before he began transposing them into fiction. What the novel also carried, less visibly, was Rayner's particular moral complexity toward his subject. His acknowledgement, in the book's introductory note, that the odds in such a duel actually favored the submarine, and his evident respect for the competence of men he had spent years trying to kill. That complexity, the admission that the enemy was not simply monstrous, was the seed of everything the film became. Mayes transplanted it across national lines, across languages, across an ocean, and it survived the journey intact. The Enemy Below was released in November 1957, 4 weeks after the Soviet Union launched Sputnik and remade the global ideological landscape in a single orbital trajectory. The film's central argument, that the man on the other side of an existential military confrontation is neither a freak nor a fanatic, but a professional doing a difficult job for a country he loves and a regime he does not, landed in American cinemas at the precise moment when the United States was recalibrating its understanding of what the Soviet adversary actually was. The critics who reviewed the film in late 1957 discussed it as a World War II picture. Nobody reviewed it as a Cold War picture, because the vocabulary for doing so had not yet stabilized. But the German naval officer who fights with skill and dignity against a system he considers contaminated, who has given 2 sons to a cause he finds increasingly indefensible, who continues out of professional duty rather than ideological conviction, that character was not describing 1943. He was describing 1957. The film slipped this argument past its audience because it had disguised it in period uniform. The most consequential downstream effect of The Enemy Below is one the film never received acknowledgement for and whose scale was not apparent until decades after its release. In 1966, the Star Trek episode Balance of Terror reproduced the film's structure so precisely, the cat-and-mouse duel between a surface vessel and a submerged craft, the mutual respect developing between commanders who never meet until the end, the sympathetic enemy who serves his cause without sharing its ideology, that its own director, Vincent McKevety, later acknowledged the similarity with the admission. Obviously, it is the same story. The Star Trek Compendium formally identified the episode as a science fiction version of the film. What McEvety's episode then produced, the Romulans, the concept of the neutral zone, the dramatic grammar of the space duel, became foundational to the entire Star Trek franchise for the next 60 years. Nicholas Meyer subsequently identified The Enemy Below as a direct inspiration for Star Trek II, the Wrath of Khan's central battle sequences, telling Sci-Fi Wire, "It is a F***King great movie. The film that 1957 critics received as a competent naval thriller fathered a science fiction franchise. The royalties, moral and financial, were never paid. The critical reception of The Enemy Below in late 1957 was generous, technically admiring, and almost entirely wrong about what it was looking at. Variety praised it as fast-paced and commended its action sequences, noting with mild condescension that, once in a while, the gallantry gets a bit thick, in the style of World War I aviation films. Bosley Crowther in the New York Times acknowledged the film's professional competence and Mitchum's ease of command without examining the moral architecture underneath. The consensus treated the film as an above-average genre exercise, a well-made war picture that happened to give the Germans some sympathetic lines. None of the major reviewers identified the Cold War argument embedded in von Stolberg's disillusionment. None noticed that the film was, structurally, the first American war film to build its entire dramatic tension around two equally legitimate protagonists rather than a hero and a villain. They reviewed the submarine chase. They missed the philosophy. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union dissolved. 2 generations of post-Vietnam American cinema produced a body of work interrogating the moral equivalences of military conflict, and The Enemy Below, which had made that argument 12 years before Vietnam and 32 years before the Berlin Wall came down, was retroactively revealed as the film that had been most precisely right, most ahead of its moment, most structurally honest about what adversarial conflict between professional soldiers actually involves. Von Stolberg's bitterness toward the New Germany reads today not as a convenient dramatic device for making the enemy palatable, but as a precise description of the condition of any professional soldier who continues to serve a cause whose political direction he has ceased to believe in. That description applies to the German Navy in 1943, to Vietnam-era American officers in 1968, to Soviet generals watching the Afghanistan campaign deteriorate in 1984. The film's moral argument was not historically specific. It was permanently true. It required 60 years of subsequent history to make that truth fully visible. The film that survived, with its preview-determined ending, its Americanized ship, its uncredited German technical advisor, its buried philosophical argument, is imperfect. It is also, in its imperfections, more honest than the clean masterpiece it might have been. Dick Powell spent 3 years in the Utah desert making the film that would kill him, then spent a year in the Pacific making the film that would define him, then died before either legacy could be properly adjudicated. Mitchum delivered a performance that was ignored for decades. Jurgens played a man whose moral position was his own personal history. Rayner's British destroyer was transplanted into American waters and never credited for what it contributed. The ending Mays wanted, both men drowning, was voted out by an audience who preferred the characters alive, and a franchise that would run for 60 years and generate billions of dollars absorbed the film's entire dramatic grammar without acknowledgement. But here's the question that The Enemy Below leaves submerged in its final frame, in that cigarette offered across the wreckage of 2 destroyed ships. If the most politically radical American war film of 1957, the one that argued the enemy was a human being of equal dignity and equal professional competence, could only make that argument by disguising it as a nostalgic World War II adventure, rather than stating it plainly as a comment on the Cold War adversary America was actually living with, then what does that tell you about the arguments that American cinema has always been permitted to make, and which ones it has had to smuggle past the audience in period costume? And if the answer is that the most important arguments have always required a disguise, what are the war films being made right now actually saying underneath the uniform? Leave that in the comments. If this investigation changed how you see The Enemy Below, leave a like, because there are 1,000 films with buried secrets that deserve the same forensic attention, and the algorithm needs to know this kind of digging matters.